Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my mushroom waterfall incense burner. I have painted and sealed all of my mushrooms, and I wanted this piece to look a little bit more whimsical, so I went with pink and purple with a shiny metallic finish, and I'm really happy with the way that these turned out. I also resin coated the tops of the caps so that that smoke residue can be cleaned away, and the lower surfaces I sealed with some Vividye gloss varnish. Now, I did post a little short video of that paint process, and I will link that in the description below for you guys. I will also leave a link there for the part 1 tutorial, which is the making of the mushrooms for those of you who haven't seen it. And I am going to be finishing this piece today, but right now it is finally time to test the incense cone, which I have been dying to do. So I am just going to dive right into this today. Please remember to hit that like button. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more. The smoke residue left behind by that incense is a little bit oily, so you definitely want to make sure that your mushrooms are fully cured before attempting to run any smoke through them. But it is important to test that incense cone prior to assembly. On my first build, I tested that cone before paint, but after putting it together, at which point it was too late to move anything around. And again, I did shape these caps a little more efficiently around those holes, but testing the cone now is going to let me know exactly where that smoke is coming out at so that I can position the caps accordingly for the best result. It will also allow me to identify any problem areas that I might be able to address with the base and finishing. And if you guys are wondering why I chose to paint and seal these pieces first, it is because I didn't on my first build, and I found myself weaving my paintbrush into awkward areas and wound up with several bare spots on the underside that I just couldn't get to. Now, in order to test the incense cone, we do need all of these mushrooms to stand up on their own, and I had hoped to just press them into a sheet of clay, but I have shaped these a little bit differently, and they are too top heavy for that to work. So instead, I have got a thick piece of cardboard here, and I am going to be tracing those stems right onto this. I am going to trace the stem of the tallest mushroom first, and then from there I can just begin fitting each of those mushrooms against the last and tracing those stems where I want them to set. And once all my stems are traced, I am going to go ahead and cut those out with my razor knife, and then I can begin fitting each of my mushrooms into its hole. And you do want to push those all the way through the cardboard so the stem is protruding a little bit on the bottom to keep them from leaning or falling over. Here is that second mushroom, and the third. This is what it looks like, and again, all of those stems are sticking out on the bottom, so the piece should stand up fairly stable. And we also have the ability to twist those caps inside the holes so we can adjust them as needed. So I am going to go ahead and light up that incense cone and see how it looks. Here it is, guys. Now this piece also is a little bit slow to start, and I really think it's just my incense cone, but you can see that that smoke is coming out right where I want it to. I had talked about adding some secondary mains to these, and I don't think that's going to be necessary. The shorter of those two medium mushrooms isn't quite filling, but they're not super stable in this cardboard base, and you'll notice that there is a significant gap there. So if I push those two medium ones to the center to close that gap, all three of those mushrooms fill and spill over beautifully. Now I will have to turn or reposition that smallest cap in the front a little bit to keep the smoke from escaping over the back, but other than that, it looks pretty good. And you might have to test that cone a couple of times, repositioning those mushrooms as needed, but once you find an arrangement that you're happy with, we can move on to the base. Now I did turn that smallest cap in the front a little bit, just so the other two spouts are pouring into it towards the center. I pushed everything together just slightly, and that one mushroom I decided was angled too far forward. So I pushed the hole in a little bit and widened it so that I can angle that stem backwards and make it set just slightly straighter. Now I am making a 2-part base for this, and I am starting with a thin sheet of cardboard and the lid for a Cool Whip dish for size. So I am just going to trace this piece and cut it out, and you want to position your mushrooms closer to one side of the circle rather than in the center. This will ensure that you have enough room in the front for that smallest cap to spill into the base rather than over the side of it. So I am going to grab this thicker piece of cardboard and I am going to stand the stems up inside of it again, and you want to push them as far back as you can without the caps hanging over the side. So I am just going to use my pencil to make sure here that those caps are all inside the circle as well. And then I'm also going to fit my smallest cap in here and make sure that we have a little bit of room there in the front for it to spill over. Now this one is pointed in and the outer base is going to make it just a little bit wider. So I think this will be fine. So I am going to go ahead and trace those holes where I want them. And I am going to be using this heavier piece of cardboard, but I want to trim away the edges first. So I am just going to trace all the way around the outsides of those holes. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut that out, and I am hot gluing that right onto my circle, fitting those holes back over those places that we traced. And then I'm going to trace and cut one more round of that thinner cardboard and glue it to the bottom side with the 2 shiny sides facing in. This is what it looks like, and I am going to be gluing those mushrooms onto the base prior to adding my clay. So I am going to add the tallest one first, and you want to put the 2 medium mushrooms into those holes and fit them up to the largest one to make sure that your holes are positioned appropriately. And then holding that position, I am going to remove the 2 smaller ones and add a generous amount of hot glue into that hole and fit that tallest mushroom right in there. Here it is, and I am going to repeat that process with the remaining 3 mushrooms, again, fitting them each against each other before gluing. Here it is, and this is going to keep those stems nice and sturdy and stable while we add the clay base. It's also going to keep them from leaning or falling over while that clay is curing. And I am going to be adding my clay to the base in scraps, rolling it into a sheet and then tearing off individual pieces and sticking them on there, cutting away areas to fit around those stems and trimming off the excess around the sides. Now I did consider cutting the holes in the sheet of clay and laying that over the base before gluing the mushrooms in. My concern with that was that the moisture would prevent my glue from sticking, and another thing is that doing it this way allows me to really push that clay up against those stems and into the base as well to ensure good adherence without having to worry about any gapping or bubbles. And once that base is fully covered, I will go through and blend all of those sections together and smooth over the surface and edges. And then I am also going to add some additional clay right here at the base of each one of those stems just for some additional reinforcement. Here is that lower base, and the surface down there is a little bit uneven, but after I add some texture to it, I think it will look very natural. And for texture, I am using this little wire tool, and I am going to be just gently dotting that over the surface. Now, if you don't have one of these, you can get a very similar effect with a wire brush, toothbrush, or even some sandpaper. We're just going for a kind of coarse, dirt-like texture. So I have textured that entire lower surface, and I hate to say it, but we do need to set this piece aside once more and allow the clay to cure around those stems. Meanwhile, though, this is a great time to start thinking about your decor elements. Now, on my first build, I added some moss and small mushrooms to the ends of those stems, but aside from that, the base is pretty bare, and this doesn't look bad. The problem is that because those back 3 mushrooms are so tall, it allows for a lot of airflow in between those stems, which can cause your smoke to blow off course or be dispersed into the air. So for this build, I am going to be adding some additional decor elements to kind of fill in those empty spaces and reduce some of that airflow. Now, for this to be effective, I do need to choose something that stands taller than my base walls, but because this is an incense burner, I also want something that's easy to clean and won't be permanently stained or damaged by that smoke residue. So I am going to be making some clay rocks, which I know sounds really boring, but I am going to be dressing them up with some moss and adding some tiny mushrooms and small leaves for additional height and color. And these pieces are made from polymer rather than air dry clay. I do have a video on my channel for the mini mushrooms. I chose the rounded style caps, but that video does feature some pointed and flat style caps as well, and I will link that in the description below for you guys. Now the leaves here were made using a mold. This one you can certainly make your own by hand, and I didn't do anything special with these. I just popped them out and then pinched the ends together and rolled that into a short stem. And then after baking, I did brush these with some color shifting metallic green, and I think they look really good. And for the rocks themselves, I am using some foil, and I am just going to be balling this up into a small irregular shape and then covering that in clay. Now I am going to be doing the seam stonework on the outside border that I used on the first build, and I think I'm going to build that up a little bit higher on the back side so we don't have to worry too much about this area. It's just the two gaps on either side in the front and the space in between. So I am going to begin wrapping that first stone, trimming off the excess as I go, flattening the bottom, and smoothing over that surface. Here it is, and for texture, I am starting with some line work, so I am just making some very shallow, straight lines, working all the way around the piece and moving in different directions. And then I'm going to take that wire tool again and add some subtle dot texture around that piece as well. And lastly, I am using the ball end of that straight pen to make some small pits and divots here and there. This is what it looks like, and I don't know how well you guys can see that texture because it's white, but it looks great. And now I'm adding some moss, and making moss from air dry clay can be a little bit tricky just because it is so soft and blendy. So you want to use a piece of clay that's fairly thick for the moss, and you need plenty of moisture on the lower surface to make sure that that moss adheres well, but the top surface you want to be fairly dry before adding your texture so that the tool doesn't stick to it and pull it off. I am using that wire tool again for texture, and unlike polymer clay, you don't want to move in any circular motions here. The trick is to push and pull. So you want to start by pushing that clay away from you and pulling it upwards, and then pulling that clay towards you and pushing it downward. This technique allows for a deeper mossy texture that's very even and won't crumble or fall apart while you're trying to paint it. And the last thing I want to add here is some of those little suction cup mushrooms. So I am just flattening some little clay balls on here and then hollowing out the centers with my dotting tool. Now I can add my mushrooms, pushing those stems right into the clay, and I am going to be adding 3 or 4 of these, fitting them up to the base as I go to make sure that they're visible and not running into anything. I am adding the leaves the same way, just pushing them into the top, and I am going to be removing these pieces before painting, but I want that clay to cure around those holes. And I am going to be adding that same mossy texture, tiny mushrooms and leaves to the bottoms of each of those stems on the base as well. And once that piece is fully cured, I am going to remove the leaves and the mushrooms so I can paint it. Now these holes can be really hard to find after the paint is on there, so I have added some wire here just to keep track of them. The holes for the leaves are a little bit larger, so I'm not too worried about those. Here it is, and I am so happy with the way that this piece turned out. I think it looks really, really good. For the moss, I started with this darker marsh green all the way around those outside edges, and then I filled in the rest of that with this brighter shamrock green, and then brushed the whole thing with that same color shifting metallic green that I used on the leaves so that everything matches well. And the same thing for the stone here. I used two different shades of gray and then brushed the surface with some metallic black so that it's nice and shiny. And those little suction cups, I just painted bright orange. And I did make 3 of these. I have another oblong one here that's a little bit larger, and then one that is much more rounded, and I used those same colors on my base piece as well so that everything will match and blend together cohesively. Now, I think I am going to make some smaller stones to kind of scatter around the rest of that piece. And then I really like this brighter spring green for the base floor. So I am going to finish painting the floor, and then I'm going to place these. The round one is going to go right in the middle here in between the shortest and tallest mushroom, and the other 2 I am going to place on either side. And you do want to position them so that you have a little bit of space left over there on the edge of the border. So I am going to get my pieces glued down, and I will be right back with you guys. And I am using air dry clay slip to adhere these, but you can certainly use glue if you want to. Here it is, guys, and I am really impressed with the way that these rocks look in there. I wanted to do something more elaborate for my decor pieces, and I chose the rocks instead because they were super simple and fast to make, but I will admit that they look much better than I thought they would. I'm not disappointed at all, but before we move on, I will share a few of my top picks for decor. The first one is crystals, particularly the spike type crystals. These come in all different sizes and colors, and they would look really great kind of jutting up from the base of those stems. Other natural stones like amethyst or quartz are also great choices, and you can make all of these from polymer clay or resin to reduce the weight and size them to fit. Number 2 is character figures, and if you're going for a more natural look, you could choose animals like frogs or salamanders, or you can create your own wood, plant, or stone type characters, and this is one of my favorite ideas, and for simplicity's sake, I did refrain from putting little faces on my rocks. Number 3 is plant life, which I feel like is essential for a piece like this, but you do have to be very careful with your selection. Smaller pieces made from air dry clay will likely be too delicate to clean. The same thing goes for dried plants or mosses, and anything made of cloth or silk will definitely be destroyed by that smoke residue. So if you're considering fake plants, you want to choose the more plasticky, like fish tank type plants. And if you're making them from clay, it's best to go with either succulents or tuberous or woody type plants that tend to have thicker leaves and stems for durability. Now, once they're sealed, all of these lower surfaces should be pretty easy to clean with a small cloth or Q-tip. They won't hold up to any heavy scrubbing, but anything left behind in those little cracks and crevices will just make the piece look more natural. These decor elements can also be used to address any problem areas that you might have noticed on your test burn. You can see my mushrooms peeking out behind here, but leaves and tall grasses, when placed around those spouts, are especially useful in redirecting the flow of that smoke. So all that's left to do now is the lower base, the base walls, and then I would like to do one more test burn on this before adding the finishing touches to the caps. Making the outer base is pretty simple, but you will need quite a bit of clay. This is the last of the brick that I started this project with, and I do have some more here to finish it up. I've rolled this sheet of clay fairly thick and large enough that my inner base will fit inside of it, and you will want to do this on some type of mobile work surface. I am using a piece of pressed wood, but you can use anything that's solid and has a flat, smooth surface. I am starting with a little bit of water, and then I'm going to set that inner base right in the center here. And when I made the cardboard form for this, I didn't glue those rounds together all the way to the edges, and it caused my top layer to warp a little bit, and I did glue those edges back together, but I have a pretty significant gap here that I'm going to have to deal with. Now, the process here is basically the same. I am going to start with some strips of clay around that inner base piece, pressing those both into the lower piece and also up against the edge of that inner base. And because of those gaps I had, I am just using some additional clay, kind of packing it in there to fill in that empty space. So if your inner base sets flat like it's supposed to, you'll just be using less clay and your edging here will be shorter and probably much neater and more even than mine. And once that's done, I am just going to trim away the excess on the sides, and you want to leave just enough room here for that stone border. So maybe a quarter to a half inch, and I am cutting that all the way around, trying my best to maintain an even distance around that inner circle. And now I can begin building that stone wall, and I am just rolling my clay into some small irregular shapes, placing them on that outside edge, and then flattening them against that inner lip, applying downward pressure as needed to maintain that outside edge as well. Now, my first few pieces were a little bit round, so I do have some significant gaps there that I will fill in with some tiny balls of clay. But once I have a point of reference, I will start shaping those pieces and really kind of squishing them together for a nice tight fit. And I am going to be building that wall just about a half inch or so higher than the base floor, a little bit taller in the back, and filling in any gaps on the inside as I go. And once I've made it around, I will be using that wire tool again to add some subtle texture to the outside surface. This is what it looks like. I did go over all of those walls with a thin layer of air dry clay slip to help with adherence, and this piece is going to need probably several days to fully cure. And a couple things while that's curing. The first one is that air dry clay is subject to shrinkage, so you will without a doubt notice several gaps beginning to form in that stone wall. Most of these will likely appear within the first 24 hours, at which point you might have individual pieces or even whole sections that have detached completely. And this is where clay slip really shines. I applied a second coat of that on day 2, a little bit thicker this time, allowing it to settle in all of those cracks, and by day 3 I only had a few wider gaps, mostly on the top rim, that needed a third application. Now, if you're not using slip, you can fill in those spaces with some additional clay, but I would recommend using vinegar rather than water to moisten your clay and apply those pieces. And you don't need a lot of it, just a little bit of it on your fingertips will do. It'll leave your clay slightly sticky, which makes it easier to work with, and more importantly, it will form a more solid bond versus just water to that cured clay, so you won't have to worry about any of those pieces falling out later down the line. Now, when we're talking about structural integrity, both of these methods are equally effective. Clay slip is faster and easier to apply, but you do have to wait for each application to dry before adding another, so the process is longer. And because clay slip is thinner and a little bit messy, it can result in some loss of texture on the surface. The clay and vinegar method will go by much faster because you can just work your way around and you shouldn't have to worry about any loss of texture. But the process is obviously much more tedious. Now, you can use a small paintbrush to help pack the clay into those cracks and smooth the surface, but some of those spaces, mostly on the inside wall in the back, are going to be a little bit more difficult to get to. The next thing is to just be really patient and careful with this. The underside will require the most time to cure, so just because the outside walls are sturdy does not mean that the piece is safe to move or pick up. I waited a solid 48 hours before attempting to move my piece at all. On day 3, I checked the underside, and instead of lifting it, I just gently slid it across my work surface, holding it as low as I could on that base to avoid putting any pressure on those stone walls. And I slid that base until the edge of it was overhanging the side of the board just a little bit in order to see and feel the underneath, which was still a little bit soft. So I left it overhanging and then began rotating it about a quarter turn every 4 hours or so for the remainder of day 3. By day 4, my piece was solid enough to pick up and handle, but I felt like the very bottom still needed a little bit more time, so I propped it up on some cardboard and gave it one more day. This is day 6 now, and this piece is finally cured. Everything feels very solid and stable. The back wall here I had originally built up a little bit higher, but I didn't like the way it looked, and I decided it was going to be far too difficult to paint on the inside. So I pulled some of those stones off, so it is a little bit uneven, but I think it looks pretty good. And again, you can see that I lost a little bit of that surface texture due to my clay slip, but it was a small price to pay for the stability that it now has. I'm able to pick it up and handle it, and I can even turn it all the way over in my hands without anything loosening or coming undone. And now I am going to finish painting this. I need to paint the outside edge of that base floor, and then I have a few little spots that I need to touch up on my stones here. And the wall I am painting the same way that I did those stones on the inside. I've got some granite and elephant gray here, and then some metallic black to go over the top. And I've also decided that I want a little bit of sparkle on this. So I've got these Glitterific craft paints. I'm going to be using the black on the wall and over all of those stone surfaces on the inside. And then the silver one I want to use just on the outside rims of those caps and maybe on the lower edges of those mains as well, if I can get to them. And you want to make sure that all those lower surfaces are painted and sealed before doing the second test burn, which I'm probably going to do off camera, but I will share the results of that test with you guys during the finishing and talk about some different things that you can do to address any issues that you might still have with that smoke. Here it is, guys, and my stone wall is quite a bit darker than I wanted. The inside of that wall turned out to be far more difficult to paint than I had anticipated. A lot of those areas, especially on the back side, I could barely get to with my paintbrush, and I wasn't able to blend my colors efficiently, so it turned out darker than I wanted. And rather than going back and trying to fix it, I just made the outside a little bit darker to match it. I don't think it looks bad though. The darker color creates a nice contrast with those bright greens, and I did add that glitter over the top of it, which kind of changes colors when it moves, so there is something to explore there. You can also see that black glitter sparkling off of some of those inside stones as well. It's not as heavy there, but I think it looks great. And I really love the glitter on the rims of those caps. I think it's beautiful, and I was able to get the edges of those mains too. Now my test burn went really well. I only had a few issues, and they were very minor. On this cap, those larger cracks that I added on the sides, one of them is positioned right underneath that smoke hole, and it wasn't an issue on my first burn. It's possible that I shifted that cap a little bit when I glued it, but that crack is drawing that smoke downward and causing it to drain underneath the cap. Now it is a very slow leak, so it still allows for the cap to fill up nicely, but prevents it from ever spilling over, which was really confusing for me at first because I could see that smoke spilling into the cap from the hole, and I thought, where the hell is it going? So it took me a minute to track down that leak, but I am going to have to put something over that crack to stop that from happening. And then on this side, I just have a small area on the back of the cap where the smoke is escaping over the side. So I just want to put something there for that smoke to kind of run into so that it can't escape. And there isn't a whole lot of space in there, so I do need to choose something that's small enough to fit, but still meshes well with the rest of my decor. And again, to keep things nice and simple, I am going to go with some little ladybugs. These are super cute, and they're so easy to make. These are made from polymer clay, and I started by flattening out a small red ball of clay for the body and then sticking on a smaller black ball for the head here, and the legs I rolled and cut separately and then picked them up one by one using the body. The crack between the wings here I cut in with my razor knife, and then after baking I painted that and added the little black dots. I used mica powders to make these nice and sparkly, and I did make them in 2 different colors. On the right here, I have the bright red mica powder, and the left one was done with some chameleon red, so it's a little bit darker and kind of changes color in the light. And I did make several of these. I'm going to use a few where I need them, and the rest of them I'm going to spread around my piece for a more cohesive finish. Now, there are several different things that you can use in those spaces. Stray moss is a really great choice, and it also does well on that base wall if you feel like it still looks a little bit plain. The tiny leaves and mushrooms are a little bit delicate, so you probably don't want to use them on the caps or the outside wall where the piece tends to get touched more. And the only reason I didn't use moss on the wall and I'm not using it here is because I have already added those decor elements to every other patch of moss on the piece, and I was afraid that adding just moss in certain places would look odd. So I went with ladybugs, but any type of small insect, colorful beetles, roly-polies, things like that would do really well in there. Now, I didn't have any issues with that smoke around my spouts here, but if you still have problem areas that you weren't able to address with your base decor, things like snails, slugs, and caterpillars are super effective when placed on the outside rims, or you can stretch them in between those caps to help with the flow of that smoke as well. So I am going to go ahead and glue my ladybugs on there, and I will be right back with you guys for the final reveal.